Your Legislators is made possible in part by the generous financial support of MAPE members, making Minnesota clean waters, safe communities, quality education, and veterans care happen. We work hard for Minnesotans. Live from St. Paul, Minnesota, we welcome you to another season of Your Legislators, a roundtable discussion featuring state lawmakers who are prepared to answer your questions and discuss important issues affecting citizens of Minnesota. Now, here's your moderator for tonight's program, Barry Anderson.
Good evening and welcome to this week's version of Your Legislators. We're delighted that you have returned with us this week as we, I shouldn't say celebrate the arrival of spring, but we'll say we celebrate the arrival of 40 degrees, and that's, in Minnesota, that's an accomplishment. We're delighted that you join us on this Thursday evening for a discussion of public policy, and we have a distinguished panel of guests this evening to help unravel the mysteries of St. Paul. This week we're heavy on veterans, and we'll be getting to our introductions of our guests in just a moment. I want to remind you that this is your program. We want you to call in your questions. They will be sent to us, as I said in our first program this year, via fax and other fancy technologies, and we'll see that they get to the panel. You can also communicate with us via Facebook and Twitter, and we'll talk more about that as the program unfolds. So let's begin this evening, as we do each week, with an introduction of our distinguished panel. And to my immediate left, I think it's fair to call Representative Carlson a veteran legislator. You've been around here a year or two. Tell the viewers a little bit about yourself.
Well, my name is Lyndon Carlson, as you point out, and I represent about half the city of Crystal, the vast majority of New Hope, and have part of Plymouth. And being that I'm in the majority, I'm fortunate enough to chair a committee, and I happen to chair the House Ways and Means Committee. I'm a retired teacher. And retired social studies, as I recall. That's right.
Yeah.
So government and economics.
Right.
Mainly.
We've had some discussion about civics education and civics in the past, and we'll maybe have a chance to do that again. Okay. Another veteran legislator joining us who has not been with us much in the last few years. We're absolutely thrilled that he's returned to our set this evening, District 64, St. Paul, Senator Richard Cohen. Senator Cohen, a lawyer. Tell our viewers a little bit about yourself.
As you mentioned, I practiced law when outside the legislature. Was elected just when I finished school, so I've been doing this for a while, don't know much else, and represent, as you mentioned, 64 in St. Paul, which is basically the western side of St. Paul.
Also joining us from District 22 in Laverne, Senator Bill Weber. I think, Senator Weber, you're probably not our rookie, but probably our least veteran legislator here this evening, right?
I think that would be correct.
Tell our viewers a little bit about yourself.
Well, I was elected in 2012. I'm from Laverne, Minnesota. My Senate district includes all or parts of 9 counties in the southwest corner. I have 72 miles of border with South Dakota and 60-some miles of border with Iowa. And obviously, we're a very agricultural district. And I'm in my second year here, obviously, and it's been a busy couple years. I have from 2012 to now, I had both my children got married. I got elected to the Senate, and I became a grandpa. So
these things are all important, and maybe more important than some of the things that are transpiring at the Capitol. But we'll talk a little bit further about that. We talked a little bit about Laverne before the program began. I mentioned to you that my high school debate coach, who I'm very fond of and a very important part of my life, Marlon Spangrud, spent many years in Laverne, and to this day speaks very highly not only that community but Rock County and the surrounding area.
Thank you very much.
And finally, someone who's been with us many times over the years from District 8A, Fergus Falls, Representative Bud Nornis. Representative Nornis, tell our viewers a little bit about yourself.
Glad to be here. I represent just half of one county, and I feel pretty fortunate to have that kind of a district. It's Otter Tail County, and it stretches from Fergus Falls in the west to Perham, kind of on the northeast. And, we got a lot of lakes, and we got a lot of farms. We got just about everything up there. That's just a great area to represent, in my opinion. So,
Senator Cohen, let's start with you. You and I were visiting a little bit before the program started about an issue that doesn't get a lot of attention. It's not necessarily something that the media covers closely, but it can be pretty important, not only to the current legislature, but maybe even more important to future legislatures. And that's the question of the reserve fund and how that works and what we might be doing to it this session. You have a bill. You've been talking about it. Tell our viewers a little bit about that.
A couple of things. And in fact, Lynn could speak to this as well. I chair the Senate Finance Committee, so I'm Lynn's counterpart in the Senate. And we've been through these ups and downs now for the last number of years, whether it be the high surpluses of the late 90s into the first part of the decade, and obviously the deficits the last 10 years. And if you want to have some fiscal stability in the state and not have the yo-yo effect that these budgets have had, you need to build up a reserve to protect against difficult times. Any business will have some type of reserve. Families will have a reserve. And obviously, a government needs a reserve. The figure that we have for the reserve now in statute, the $653 million, was established in 2001, has not been increased, although the budget's gone up significantly since then. Any economist in the state will tell you that one of the things you can do to most protect the fiscal stability of Minnesota is to provide a solid reserve. Today in the Finance Committee, when we heard the bill, not just myself, but Senator Skoye's bill, who chairs the Tax Committee, where historically the reserve account has been, and so it was actually Senator Skoye's bill that we passed out of the Finance Committee to the Tax Committee. We had the testimony not only of Commissioner Showalter, the Commissioner of Management and Budget, but also Dr. Tom Stinson, who has just retired as the state's chief economist, somebody I think is probably the single most valuable person I've ever met in state government. And he testified about almost the mandatory need to increase the state's budget reserve. I'm optimistic that we'll take the number. It'll go through the legislative session, be approved by the governor, and again provide that much more stability so we can start to build back our bond rating and again not have this kind of up and down effect we've had with the state budgets over the last several years.
Well, I would agree that a reserve is healthy. The only thing that I would add to what Senator Cohen was saying is that we were fortunate enough to be able to provide the filling of the cash flow account as well. So we have both the formal reserve and cash flow account. So together they're at about $1 billion. Now that sounds like a big number, but when you look at the size of the state budget and the fluctuation that can sometimes take place, probably better to have a larger reserve than what we currently have. I was at a conference a short time ago, and the Pew Foundation had studied the reserves in various states, and quite frankly, Minnesota was a bit on the low side in terms of the size of our budget and how much is in the reserve.
Any thoughts on this, Representative Ernest?
I only that I would agree that we do need a reserve, and it has been where we've gone to find some extra money in an emergency, and I think that's what it's for. I don't know what the magic number is as far as how much needs to be in there. It's hard to project even with the current surplus projection, how accurate that's going to be. So, I guess I support having as much in there as possible, but I have it a reasonable amount so that, $1 billion in reserve may be too much. I don't know. But you would know better than I in that position that you have, perhaps.
Senator Weber?
Well, thank you. I think I don't think there's any question that there needs to be a reserve. Certainly, as we look at the surplus, we recognize that surpluses come and surpluses go, and as a result of that, we need that reserve. I think also, however, we need to take a look at what has created that surplus, and I think so far, the House has passed. Repeal of the business-to-business taxes that have been talked about. So far, that hasn't been accomplished in the Senate, and yet we need to remember that that money, came from the people, and I think where we can repeal the necessary taxes, I think we need to do that. The other thing I think we need to be careful of is there are many bills being introduced that also initiate new programs in which to spend some of the surplus money, and I think that's a dangerous path to go down, is to initiate programs that are financed by what really are one-time monies at this point in time. And therefore, we need to look at the reserve. We need to maybe look at some of our capital needs with infusion of one-time money.
If I may, on the question of the cash flow, I think it's important to distinguish between the cash flow account and the reserves. If you don't have an adequate cash flow account, you might have to end up with short-term borrowing and different things to pay the state's bills. Revenue doesn't come in evenly. We'll get an influx in
April.
Yeah,
For obvious reasons.
And so that's the purpose of the cash flow account. And I view the reserve as a little different. So when I used a number of $1 billion, that was combining the two, but they do have different purposes.
All right, if you were from, I'm going to run through some of the questions we've had in the last couple of weeks that we didn't get to that maybe are somewhat new and haven't talked about over the last few weeks. One of them is a question from a viewer in St. Paul who wants to know whether or not the legislature has any role to play in the proposed Polymet copper-nickel mine decision, or will that decision to permit the mine be left to the EPA, DNR, and perhaps other agencies? Who wants to take a run at the mining question? Representative Nornes, I guess by geography you're closest, right?
I did sit in on a presentation by the company. In Fergus Falls, the Chamber of Commerce hosted a meeting so we could better understand, what the proposal is and how large the project is, although we're not anywhere close to where that would be taking place. And I found it very informative, and I guess coming away from that, it's not clear to me, where that final decision is going to be made. To me, it should be made. I think that it's really a good thing for the state of Minnesota. The concern seems to be environmental and the long-term effects of whatever they're doing up there to get those minerals out. And so I think that probably the EPA is going to be a major part of this thing, but I think for the betterment of the state, that project needs to move forward.
Yeah, I just would say, they're going through the permitting process, and that's been a long and drawn-out, very deliberative process. You do hear a lot of concern about water quality and how that would ultimately be handled on the environmental side. So I'm a little bit cautious about it, to say the least. I think we have to have several questions answered before we would move ahead with that, and that's the purpose of the permitting process, to make sure that we do have proper balance. The residents up there, I understand, are kind of divided. You've got those that are very interested in opening mining. You have those that are very interested in their tourism businesses and so on. And so there is a little tug of war there, to say the least, between the residents. And where it'll ultimately be resolved, I think, as Representative Nornes pointed out, is still to be determined.
I think, and just add one more thing to what I said earlier, the jobs are important that it would bring to that area. But it makes me wonder if we were going back in time to when iron ore was discovered up there and we were dealing with today's regulatory environment, would we have ever mined up there? Would we have ever taken that ore out of that ground? I mean, that's a question that comes to me, because today it's much more difficult, it seems, to do something that and all indications are it's relatively safe, and it's just in theory that it may not be so. Anyway, just wanted to add.
Well, and Representative Nornes makes a good point in terms of where we would have been 60, 70, 80 years ago, but obviously what's happened during that time is that people are that much more aware of environmental concerns. I think Lynn hit the nail on the head in terms of talking about water quality. Every one of us takes huge pride in Minnesota water. The streams, the lakes, the recreational water that we have, the park territory, the federal land in the boundary waters. And there's some significant concerns, certainly in my district, as to what happens to the water quality and what's going to be there not for today or tomorrow, but for generations to come. And it's not to suggest that there should not be a concern about employment in the north as well as any other sector, any other part of the geography of the state. I would guess that we're not going to have any action during this year's legislative session, but the expectation would be that at some point there could be some very significant requirements placed on the company to make sure that there's environmental protection for whatever happens. If they want the mining and they want the benefits of the mining, they also have to take into account what the possible consequences, negative consequences might be, and take the responsibility for that.
Certainly the people of northeast Minnesota are no strangers to mining. And as we go forward, obviously as it was mentioned, that there's a vigorous process in the permitting of a mine, and certainly that will continue. And you alluded to, whether or not the legislature would be more involved. Certainly as we have seen various events occur in the past couple of years, I would assume that if one party or another doesn't like the final decision of the permitting authorities, that certainly there will be an attempt to bring the legislature into it again.
All right. Our next question comes from a viewer in Buffalo, but it's about a different piece of geography in Minnesota, and this is the Appleton area. 24 years ago, when I started with your legislators, one of the topics that was very much on the radar screen was a private medium security prison in Appleton, now owned but vacant by the Corrections Corporation of America. And this viewer wants to know what the status is of legislation authored by Senator Tony Laurie and Barb Goodwin that would make it illegal, at least according to the viewer, for the Minnesota Department of Corrections and all counties in the state to contract with a private company, such as the Community Corrections of America, who apparently owns that facility. And this viewer thinks that would be a bad idea, but wants to know what the status of the legislation is. Anybody know?
I do not.
Anybody have any?
I don't think it's going to be heard this year, but there's been the issue of private prisons versus public prisons, and Justice Anderson, you'd have a better sense from what you do as to what happens as a consequence, but there are certainly some significant stories, maybe anecdotal, from other states where there's been a very strong private prison component, which results in significant problems, where you take away the public ownership and the public direction. The state has to proceed carefully with continued private ownership of prisons.
I would only add one thing, that since Representative Tory Westrom became a senator, he was the one person in the House that really had this as a big issue. He was always pushing for an occupant, some private operation of that. Well, it is private, as you mentioned, but to have actually people there being cared for. And so he was always trying, because he felt strongly about that. Again, for that area, it created a lot of jobs too, and we sometimes overlook that. So I haven't heard a word about it this session, and apparently it's not.
And that's what I was going to say as well. As both of us as members of the House, it just hasn't come to the forefront this session.
So what we'll do is we'll chase down Representative Westrom and drag him onto the set, and we'll make him answer that question. So we'll catch up with him later in the session.
I would assume it would be initiated by whoever represents that part of the state. I would think that's where any action would start. So
we could probably speak for him. We've heard his speeches several times.
That's right.
I can hear it right now.
All right. A viewer from Lilydale wants to know about what's happening with legislation dealing with carp or invasive species. So what about electric barriers and the like? Who's our expert in invasive species here? Anybody want to speak to that?
Well, I don't know if I'd classify myself as an expert, but it is a very major issue this session in terms of how we manage the invasive species. I know LCCMR has been for some time, that's the Legislative Commission on Minnesota Resources, let us say Citizens Commission. I got to put the word citizen in there. That was a change a while back, but they've been very engaged with that. I know the chair of the Environmental Natural Resource Committee on the House side has been very engaged in it. I would be surprised in the end if something doesn't come forward, even though this is a short session, to try to move forward on that issue. It's just something that we need to do. And there's a debate as to what the best techniques are. I might just say that we were just at the University of Minnesota with the Capital Investment Committee, and there's major research going on there. They're getting federal funds and how to control carp, and they're very interested in how to control the Asian carp, which is a little different species. But at any rate, there's a lot of initiatives that are beginning to surface.
I just saw something on television just within the last few days on that subject at the university, and what they were talking about wasn't so much the research itself, but the quality or the condition of the research facility. and the upgrading that it's needed so that the work can be done in a little better way. But where I come from, we've got the zebra mussels. That's the primary problem. We don't have the Asian carp up that way, but it's an issue that when you've got 1,000 or more lakes just in my county, I mean, again, you talk about water quality and fishing and lakeshore. I mean, it's all part of that. And we do have zebra mussels, like I said, but we're trying to stop them from moving any further.
I think the Lessard-Sams Council, as the habitat part of the Legacy Amendment, I believe has a recommendation, if I'm not mistaken, relative to some additional money as well.
I should qualify what I just said. We only have zebra mussels in a couple of our 1,000 lakes. So.
There's no reason for people to head to Iowa or someplace else other than your county, right?
Come on up. We're hoping that actually this severe weather with ice over 3 feet thick in some places on some of our lakes, that will actually kill some of these little rascals. So we'll see if that theory.
So there's some good that comes out of it.
They don't survive in ice.
Representative Nornes mentioned the facilities. That's why we were at the university, and they are badly in need of modern labs and so on for that research. And it's really the leading research center in the entire country when you start talking, especially about the carp. Right. And they're just kind of limping along in the sense of makeshift materials to keep the lab operating. So hopefully when we do have a capital investment bill go through the House and the Senate, that's a facility that we do address.
Well, I serve on the Environment Energy Committee and the respective Finance Committee as well, and there were numerous hearings on various bills and input last year regarding the invasive species, and certainly there's been some discussion of it already this year. And obviously there are a variety of ways that money can be spent on that. I don't know if there's really an agreed upon best method to control them yet, and quite frankly, but certainly it's something that will continue to be worked upon. And just for the record, my home county doesn't have a lake, so.
So you don't have any zebra mussels?
I have no zebra mussels, no.
There are no lakes in Rock County?
No lakes in Rock County.
All right, well, very good, very good. All right, so let's talk about capital investment and the bonding bill, because that is, of course, the principal function of this so-called off-session or short session, however you want to phrase it, unsession, I guess. Maybe we'll talk about that, too. Should we start with you, Representative Carlson?
Well, I happen to be on the committee, and we're in the process of putting the bill together. There were something like $2.7 billion in requests. The bonding bill will probably be, as far as general obligation bonds, in the neighborhood of about $850 million. There's also some discussion, because our infrastructure is in such dire need of funds, that perhaps some cash might be included in that. But that's all in the process now of being discussed. It'll be the major bill of the session, and for those that are listening, when we talk about the bonding bill or the capital investment bill, we have to keep in mind that's the infrastructure of the state. So when I use a rather big number in terms of what the requests are, that's for the whole state. That's everything from bridges to college and university buildings. We have to maintain our infrastructure, and I think we have to make sure we're moving ahead in a way that we don't have any more 35W bridges, for one thing. So it's a national problem when we talk about the needs of infrastructure in the United States, and we have huge needs in Minnesota.
Senator Cohen?
I would echo that. Obviously, what remains to be seen is what the size of the bill might be, and given the constitutional requirement that you need a 60% majority to pass a bonding bill, obviously, whether an individual legislator is in the majority or the minority, everybody ends up having a say in what ultimately happens with that bill. So generally, the bonding bills have passed with some very significant bipartisan support, and would hope and expect that to be the case this year. Lynn mentioned some of the infrastructure needs. I think in the last X number of years, I'll say 10 years, there's been a real emphasis on higher education in the bill. Representative Nornes can speak to that better as as the former chair of the higher ed division, and Representative Carlson also chaired higher ed as well. I've served on that division in the past. And as somebody who serves on the Senate Capital Investment Committee, I know higher education has taken on a real prominent role, and that's that clearly should be and ought to be the case, because if we don't maintain the universities and the colleges in the state through that bonding process, you can see the schools that kind of fall into disrepair. You're not going to have that kind of infrastructure support coming from the local governments. They don't have the ability to do that. These are state institutions, and I would argue the most vital of state institutions. So I would expect, separate from some of the basic infrastructure, roads, bridges, that you'll see higher education as the major component of the bill.
Well, I think that's very true as we look at what's coming ahead. Certainly, in a number of committees, we've heard many requests that were laid over for possible inclusion into a bonding bill, and certainly our respective committees have a substantial job ahead of them to pare down those requests to finally arrive at the final bill. I think too, there's not only the state's individual needs, and certainly, but there are also some very substantial local requests that are being made for some things that are truly needful by different areas of our state. And I say that having brought a bill even for my own area to complete the Lewis and Clark rural water system that that would serve various users in southwest Minnesota. We don't often think about the state of Minnesota having water quantity issues, and yet we do in various areas. And so it is a very unique process, as I'm witnessing just being in my second year here. But I tend to agree that certainly we need to concentrate on our assets in this state and make sure that they get an appropriate amount.
And I would agree all the way around that 850 seems to be the number with a little cash thrown in. Again, higher education is a priority. I think when I was chair and I visited some of the campuses, that's the message that I gave to the administrations, that as far as I could control it, that we would be taking care of those buildings and making sure they didn't leak and that the heating systems worked and some of those basic things. And there's a lot of, I think we were inquiring in one of our committee hearings this session about the backlog. The request is for 100, I think each system is 100 million from the university and from INSCU. That's for HEPR, they call it. And that's just a drop in the bucket. They've got many other projects waiting that are lower priority. And so my comment in committee was to increase the governor's recommendation probably by double. He's at 40. I said at a minimum we should be at 80 to again address those issues. And so I think we have also somewhat of an agreement, bipartisan agreement, that we will pass one this year. Last year the bill failed, the larger bill at least, so I think it will pass. It's sort of like, maybe it isn't a good comparison, but I'm thinking it's sort of like Christmas, because you're not sure what's going to be in there until it's rolled out, and you're hoping that you've got your present in there or your project in there. And maybe the committee knows ahead of time, but the members themselves generally don't. So it's excitement to see when that comes out and you go through it.
The catch is
your project.
You can't take the gift back, though.
It's not refundable. No,
It's not refundable.
Sure.
Is exactly
Just
right.
as a little footnote, one of the busiest committees you can serve on in the legislature during the interim is the Capital Investment Committee, because we don't just accept the numbers in St. Paul, for the request. We actually do the site visits. And on the House side, the Capital Investment Committee was on the road 20 days this last summer and fall. Mm-hmm. And one thing that's a nice part of that committee is that you do learn about Minnesota. I'm a native Minnesotan, and you get into all corners of the state, and I've seen things that you normally wouldn't see as a tourist in other parts of the state, visiting some of the DNR lands and facilities and so on deep in the woods and that kind of thing. It's an interesting committee.
Not to put you on the spot, I mean, having said that, is there a particular project that you know, you would not have thought of as coming before the Capital Investment Committee before serving on the committee, or one that's particularly interesting, or something that is unusual, perhaps, that the public might be interested in hearing about? I mean, we know about buildings and other kinds of sort of major projects that tend to get a lot of attention, but those aren't the only things in that.
Well, there's most of it is buildings and or, like I was saying, things like bridges. One thing this last trip that was rather interesting was we were up in the Mille Lacs area, and there's an island with a number of houses on it. School bus pulled up while we were doing the site visit looking at that bridge. The bus stops, unloads the children, they walk across the bridge, and then the bus comes across. And we watched that bridge, and it was just rocking back and forth. And so maybe, I don't know if you'd call that interesting, but it was rather alarming, to tell you the truth. But you quickly learned once that bus went across why they unloaded the kids first. And that just is an example of the vital need for much of the infrastructure. And it was an old wooden bridge, literally, but a good-sized one, and it covered quite a distance.
I could add one project that was just recently completed in my district, and that was a roundabout and a new bridge. You know, not a very sexy project, really. A lot of people weren't even sure we needed it. But I tell you, that is the most popular bridge in town because it takes care of traffic as it was intended. And the roundabout is kind of fun, although they don't keep going around, but there's a temptation. But the traffic flow and the way that bridge is diverting traffic in our community was very well thought out, I'd say. And that was partly funded, not much, but a little bit was bonding money.
One thing that I've always found very interesting is when we're at the University of Minnesota, for example, and you go through some of the research labs, because you're not only looking at the facility, but you learn about some of the research projects that are going on, and it really lets you know where Minnesota is in terms of being just an outstanding institution with our higher education facilities and the research and education that go on. You learn a lot about what we're doing in the state.
Viewer from Bagley wants to know what's happening with the minimum wage. Who wants to take a run at the minimum wage? Senator Cohen, maybe start with you.
Probably appropriate since everybody's looking at the Senate. The conference committee, I believe, and I'm not on the conference committee, but I believe has agreed to a figure of $9.50. I think the major issue that is out there is the question of indexing the minimum wage to provide a periodic increase without going back to the legislature all the time. That's in the House position, represented by the House conferees, if I'm not mistaken. There are a lot of us in the Senate who would support that, at least in the majority caucus. I'm not sure the support is quite there to bring out a conference. I'm hoping we'll pass a strong minimum wage bill. I think it's needed. I think it's important for the question of income inequality. I think it's important for folks who find themselves at the lower end of the economic scale to have some ability to try to make more of a living wage than they're able to do so presently. But I'm optimistic we'll get a bill in the next couple of weeks, and for those folks who need that stronger minimum wage, they'll have it.
Senator Weber?
Well, I think that we have to remember that, and I've had a number of people say, well, we have raised the minimum wage before and we haven't lost jobs, et cetera. Well, we've never raised the minimum wage by this amount before. Either, and we want everyone to do well, to earn as much as they can possibly earn, and yet I am confident that if the minimum wage bill is passed under the terms that Senator Cohen talks about, that it is going to cost people in my district a job. I had information from a grocer who actually has 20 youth that are hired, and he gave the average hours, and he worked it out with all the costs that are associated due to this raise, and his increased cost for the year based on their hours is just under $51,000. And, those there will be a cut of hours, or there will be a cut of people, and there will be individuals that are going to suffer as a result of this increase if it goes through. Another problem that we have is with our nursing homes. We have not done an adequate job as a state in the money that we've allowed our nursing homes to have. And I have over 20 nursing homes in my district. And they have been asking for raises for years. The state has not allowed sufficient raises in years and over the years. And there is going to be a serious problem with this sudden increase in the minimum wage, and in relationship to where their existing workers are right now. And if, quite frankly, if the legislature isn't more cooperative than they have been, we will continue to see nursing homes be closed, and they will close even at a faster rate than what they have been.
Representative Norris?
Well, I guess I'm disappointed that the proposal is taking such a dramatic jump. I was very, I guess, convinced that if we could go to the federal minimum at $7.25 as the first move, with perhaps some other increases, but not the big one we're talking about. People in my district were comfortable with that too. Businesses, we can live with that, and a gradual increase would be something they could also live with. But at $9.50, I've had some major employers call me, and we're only 20 miles from North Dakota. You give them a building, and they're in North Dakota. They don't have to be in Minnesota. They don't have to be in Fergus Falls. And yet it's not that they're paying minimum wage in a lot of cases either, but it does affect their business. And I'm really troubled by the amount of money that the legislature seems they can just take from businesses and nothing negative will happen from it. Like they will just increase their prices, or they'll sell more of something. And in this economy, that's not going to happen. In Fergus Falls, we've already lost the Kmart store. It's closed. Business is okay, but it's pretty fragile. And I think that's pretty true all across the state of Minnesota. Most of the businesses that are, well, the one I mentioned, I mean, a lot of them are paying substantially more than minimum wage now. And yet I have, like you, grocery stores, hire a lot of students. They have carry-out service. I could see carry-out service being a thing in the past. They don't have to do it. So those jobs will be gone. I don't see any positives with an increase up to $9.50. Now, is there any tip credit in there? That's the other question that people ask for the restaurant workers. I assume there's not. And that would be another thing that would be at least a little bit more tolerable for those that are in the restaurant business.
I guess here's the issue that kind of divides the two sides of the table here. I fully agree with Senator Cohen. I think that there's an increase needed in the minimum wage. I know that the comment was made that it was too big a jump. It's being phased in under the bill. It doesn't go immediately to $9.50, so it's phased in over time. If we look at the last time the minimum wage was increased, inflation has eaten away at it. And what we're really trying to do is get back to the purchasing power that the minimum wage was at the last time it was passed. And in fact, some would say that at $9.50, it's still not quite where we were a few years ago when we passed the minimum wage, that if you adjusted it for inflation, it probably should be closer to $10 an hour. But I don't think you should have to work or be working full-time and live in poverty. And there are other parts of the state budget that are hit as a result of this, because then a lot of the people, because they're making a substandard wage, then qualify for some of the public assistance programs and so on. So through our tax dollars, we're often subsidizing sometimes some very prosperous businesses, because they're paying a minimum wage, and their employees have to go out and be subsidized in a variety of ways through different programs.
The question I would have of the legislators themselves is, of the House, of the Senate, what percentage do you think are those that have come from business, that have had any experience in running a business, owning a business? I think it's a pretty small number. So the people that are that are in our cluster here at the House and Senate making this decision, I think some have a hard time relating to what it takes to run a business today.
Well, I certainly have talked to a number of business owners in my district who feel that increasing the minimum wage is needed and something that they can support. I would recognize there's a difference between the economy of greater Minnesota and the Twin Cities, and certainly a place like my district, which is in pretty good economic shape. Bill raised some of the issues. I mean, I think the conferees are looking at the question of youth employment and some of the other pieces of the minimum wage. But relative to what Lynn said, just think of the numbers. I was just doing some of the arithmetic. If you raise the minimum wage to that $9.50, you'll have somebody making minimum wage who will make somewhere around $15,000 to $16,000 a year. That's before taxes. At least in the Twin Cities. I can't speak for some of the non-metro districts, but an apartment rent is around $700 to $750 a month. That's $9,000 a year. That means that person receiving the proposed minimum wage, and again, that's before taxes, will have approximately $6,000 plus to live on, exclusive of rent. That would include utilities, that would include food, that would include transportation. Who's able to live on that? Even if you raise the minimum wage, you'll still have people living at a substandard basis. As Lynn pointed out, with the very wide gap in time relative to an increase in minimum wage, if you compare it on an inflationary basis, we're just keeping pace with where inflation has been. And even with inflation at a fairly minimal amount over these last number of years, there still is not much purchasing power with a minimum wage job. And Bill, you talked about speaking with people in your district, and we've all done that relative to this issue. I've run into people, not necessarily from my district, but people who work at minimum wage who don't pay rent. The reason is that they live in their car, and they can't afford rent, and they're working at minimum wage. I think it's almost a moral issue that we have to raise the minimum wage.
I think minimum wage is intended, I think, to be it's an entry-level wage. It's not supposed to be a living wage, I don't think, or something that you would hope you'd aspire to something that's better than that after learning the job that you're hired to do.
I think you're right, and I think unfortunately we have created a business climate in Minnesota that really has not allowed that to happen. Sending jobs across the state line is nothing new to Minnesota. We had two homegrown businesses in Laverne Truck Equipment, Laverne Fire Apparatus. They grew from 60, 70 jobs combined to over 200. The trouble is that growth happened in Brandon, South Dakota. A variety of issues besides the taxes. In those years, there was workers' comp and unemployment insurance. And quite frankly, with the last year's budget and the tax increases of over, including about $2 billion worth, we have managed to send people across the lines again. In light of the fact that with the estate tax and gift tax issues, we're not now losing jobs. I'm losing retired people out of my communities. And the really sad thing about that is that group of people who were successful in business, had successful careers, successful jobs, and managed to accumulate some wealth, as in retirement, they have become an integral part of that, have remained an integral part of that community. When there is a charitable organization, the church, or other activities that have a fund drive, they're the first ones that are approached. When we need volunteers, they're the first ones that are approached. When we need people to mentor our youth, they're the first ones that are approached. And now they're moving across the state line. And so what we're doing is not only raising money in the state of Minnesota, we're destroying the fabric of our rural communities.
If I can just, I know we've talked quite a bit about this issue.
This I think is important. Go ahead.
But just to respond, because I do think there's a legitimate concern in terms of border areas. When you find a comparison to North and South Dakota in particular. But I think some of the issues that you raise, Bill, are going to be taken care of, and arguably within a week or so of the time this is being broadcast and taped. The gift tax, the estate tax that you mentioned. I think those issues will be dealt with fairly soon in a way that I think you would be approving. So I think some of the particular issues you raise, and I'm not dismissive of somebody who might look at a significant Minnesota state tax, which creates some problems. I think that person, if that person has the financial wherewithal to be concerned about the estate tax, that person should not be concerned about the minimum wage. That person's doing pretty well. But they'll find themselves, I think, in a comparative way, satisfied. But again, I think we have to look at the other side of the economic ledger. And Representative Norton has mentioned the question of whether or not somebody could find an entry-level position. And if you go back X number of years ago, I might agree. But the reality is that in today's economy, you've got folks working those minimum wage jobs who would be delighted to get to the next rung of the economic ladder. And they can't because of where things have been. And these aren't kids, college kids, working a summer job. We're talking about adults who have children who simply can't exist on what the current minimum wage is. And it'll be hard pressed to exist on the new proposed minimum wage.
And one thing else that I wanted to just mention, we're talking about minimum wage. We haven't even talked about the impact of the health insurance, the whole overhaul of the health insurance program on business. Business doesn't really know yet what that total picture is going to be like, but it's not going to be probably positive. It's going to cost more. And so there's all kinds of pressures, I think, on today's business that are going in the wrong direction.
And one of the other areas that's severely impacted in my region is the hospitality industry. Right now, their margins are so tight that quite frankly, their wait staff are not existing on minimum wage. They're existing on minimum wage plus tips, in some cases more than minimum wage plus tips. But right now, their margins are so tight that they said with the increase in this minimum wage, there are some of them that they're going to give up the fight and shut the door because we don't have the margins to exist with those kind of costs out in greater Minnesota.
Well, we'll have an opportunity to talk about this, I suspect, in the weeks ahead. Senator Cohen, I just ask you, you think in the next week or two this is probably going to move through? Is that kind of your prediction?
That would be my guess. Okay. I'm not sure next week, but I'll say the next 2 weeks.
Representative Carlson?
No, I would say it's going to move through. House and Senate have reached an agreement on a major part of the bill, and that's at the $9.50 per hour. Both bodies had passed an increase, and they've resolved that issue. As Senator Cohen pointed out, the biggest remaining issue is to have it adjusted for inflation. And I think once that's resolved, it'll come back from conference committee and be passed into law.
Viewer from Richfield wants to talk about taxes. This viewer is a retired veteran, wants to know whether or not the legislature is going to repeal the law that taxes retirement benefits. We've had this question in past years. This question has come up, the issue about taxing service people benefits. Is that on the table, or is there any discussion about that?
I think Representative Bob Detmer has that bill again this year to attempt to do that. It's been around before. And the argument is, sure, you're not going to tax the retirement, but they're going to move to Minnesota. They're going to live here. They're young. They're going to start another career. They're going to earn a living. They're going to pay more taxes. It's a positive for the state. That's the kind of the presentation that Bob makes, so that it's not just doing something that doesn't help the state, like when you cut the tax. But it's a positive because they will pay more taxes and bring a family here, and it's a win-win for everybody. Other states are doing it. And so I think I've actually signed on as a co-author of that. But I think it makes sense that we ought to be looking at doing that instead of I've retired. I have some retired friends that are from military, and some are still here because there's other things that bring them here besides that. But I think it would be a real positive thing for the state of Minnesota to be a real friendly place for those retired military.
Anybody know the status of that discussion?
Well, legislation has been introduced. It's a little hard to predict what may happen this legislative session in addition to what's already passed. If something is done on that regard, the probability is stronger than it would have been in past years, simply because revenue is much stronger for the state of Minnesota. And that would be an answer for any number of very worthy causes that might come forward in terms of tax questions. The House has already put a major bill through that's now before the Senate dealing with tax policy changes that will provide a lot of additional revenue for families across the state of Minnesota. I'm talking about federal conformity, which will provide roughly $200 million in tax relief. And that has a variety of components that helps a whole lot of taxpayers. So to date, that's been the main thrust on the House side.
And I think to be fair to the questioner, this year that will probably not happen. But as Representative Carlson just pointed out, the House passed their omnibus tax bill last week, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, the representatives can correct me, I think it was, if not a unanimous vote, it was very close to a unanimous vote on the House floor.
2 negatives.
2 negatives. How often do you see that with a tax bill? Never. So obviously there was wide support for that bill, which provides well over, $500 million, I believe, in tax reductions. But the important thing to remember, and I would defer to Representative Carlson as the historian among the group of us, when the constitutional amendment was put on the ballot in, the early 70s, relative to annual sessions of the legislature, the intent was that the even-numbered year, this year, would be a mop-up session. It wouldn't be a reworking of tax legislation or the state budget. It was there to do some things fairly simply. And I think what's happened is, because in 99, 2000, 2001, you had huge surpluses, and then we ran into a decade of deficits, that everybody's gotten used to us reworking taxes and budgets every year. That was never the intent of the annual sessions. And so the fact that you're passing a $500 million tax decrease bill this year does not suggest that the bill is going to deal with everything. Next year, if the economy continues as it has been, if we continue with the projected surplus for the next biennium, the 16-17 biennium, which at this point is at $2.7 billion, I believe, 2.5 or 2.7 billion. Now, again, that's going to be reduced with the tax bill, but there still will be a healthy surplus projected. There could well be the opportunity to deal with some of these other ancillary but important tax issues.
Well, I would agree. I'm not on the tax committee, and I haven't seen this particular bill over on our side. And while it makes some sense, I really don't anticipate that we'll probably initiate our tax measures are going to be initiated in the House, but that those kind of things will be initiated this year. And growing up in history, watching history of the state, always grew up believing, the odd year is going to be budget year and taxes, and the even year is going to be bonding. So.
Former mayors know about that, because they really watch what we do in terms of state budget.
Well, that's right. You've got to keep an eye on it.
I was just going to comment, Senator Cohen is absolutely correct on the history of the constitutional amendment. That's very true, and that's why this session is going to be short and sweet.
Well, do you know what the projected departure date is? Anybody have a guess as to when that is?
I'm hoping tomorrow.
That might be optimistic, or pessimistic, depending on your view.
May 20th, is that right?
Well, that would be roughly the constitutional, it is the constitutional deadline.
It could be quicker then.
But if things fall, there are just not going to be that many things on the plate, because it is the second year, and that was by design. We came in later than we usually do. We wanted to make sure before we came in that we had the most recent budget forecast, and of course that came out just as we were convening.
I think we heard some speculation last week that it might even be early May. Is that?
It could conceivably happen.
I'd like to get out before fishing season.
Yeah.
There you go.
Or before the ice week, whichever is first.
So one thing I always keep in mind is that if we set an early date at the table here, or especially if it's the leadership, then you're held to that, even though constitutionally you don't necessarily need to adjourn by that date. So we'll meet our constitutional deadline. You're a judge, you understand that.
Yes, absolutely.
But I think that there's a high degree of probability to be much earlier than that. But sometimes your crystal ball gets a little cloudy.
Now, regular viewers of this program over the course of the last few weeks will know that we sometimes presage events that show up in the newspaper 2 or 3 days later, and sometimes your genial host is actually surprised to discover that there are these issues going on at the legislature. And a few weeks ago, we started getting questions from viewers about what is the legislature doing about drones and surveillance? And I discovered, to my surprise, that in fact there is discussion going on about drones and surveillance at the legislature. Does anybody have anything that they can share with us about the status of those conversations? Because we do have viewers who are interested in that topic.
Well, you know, I can quickly say that you shouldn't have been surprised because there were discussions that were beginning last year. You know, it's been a high interest area, and that discussion has carried over into this legislative session.
There's a lot of interest among the agricultural community to use some kind of a aerial, you know, whether it's an actual drone, I guess, which I visualize as a model airplane, or a helicopter type vehicle that would be probably a little more controllable. But for checking everything from livestock to the condition of the crops to whatever else they need to see in a pretty high-tech way. But I guess the question is, they don't want to be caught checking up on the neighbors. And so there's concern, but I think it's a technology that, you know, is here, and if it has a practicality, I think we ought to, you know, try to make that possible.
I think the main concern has been the privacy side.
Right.
And will there be legislation that passes this year about this, or is this going to be something that gets discussed, studied, and then maybe laid over till next year? I shouldn't say laid over, it'll be a new session, but, you know, new bills introduced next year.
I think right now you can go to a Radio Shack or those places and buy a little helicopter. They have cameras on them, and I don't know if that'd be illegal if you let it fly, but so I mean, it's an area that, you know, we need to, I guess, keep an eye on.
Being a real estate appraiser by trade, I was always taught, and a real estate person, that, you know, your ownership, that you have a vertical level there at some point, you know, and so there are issues out there, and
that's going to be the last word on this, because we've run out of time. I want to thank our viewers for joining us tonight. I want to remind you that this is your program. You can send us questions for next week's program if you want. You can like us on our Facebook page, join in the discussion on Twitter using the hashtag #YourLegislators, and we invite you to return with us next week when we'll have another distinguished panel of guests to help unravel the mysteries of St. Paul. Thank you to our panel, thank you to the viewers, and good night.
There's much more about your legislators online at pioneer.org. Find out more about the history of the program, who's been a guest, and watch all our past episodes. There's also a photo gallery, informative links, and much more. You can also get involved and stay in touch by following us on Twitter and join the discussion on our Facebook page. Thank you for watching Your Legislators. Your Legislators is made possible in part by the generous financial support of MAPE members, making Minnesota clean waters, safe communities, quality education, and veterans care happen. We work hard for Minnesotans.